Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about the issue of unemployment. Okay, and we covered some of this already, noting a few definitions. So the labor force, population, the employed, unemployed, discouraged workers, etc. Right? We've talked about those terms already, and today what we're going to do is sort of talk about these things more in depth and go into sort of a more exhaustive discussion of the unemployment rate. And so this week's topic includes, more on how we measure and how we explain the causes of unemployment. And so if we think about the world, unemployment is an issue that almost everyone cares about. There's lots of emotions about this one, and frankly, like, people have very strong feelings. And we want to sort of dispel some myths here about the unemployment rate and what's going on. Okay, this is especially important if we consider the state of the world after the year, let's say 2007. Right. So in 2007, the Great Recession, as it's now known, was starting to begin, and unemployment received a lot of attention, culminating in the Nobel Prize, like I mentioned a few weeks ago. Right. So the three people won the 2010 Nobel Prize in economics for unemployment, right, for search frictions, basically. So when we talk about these things, we'll talk about, how unemployment rates vary across state and city lines, how they vary over time, how they vary by age, race, gender, ethnic groups, etc., right? And so we're talking about a lot of really important things this week. Okay, so let's first define how we calculate the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate, I'm going to call it U, since I'm going to use U. I'm going to call it UR. So here, but in the notes, obviously, it's lowercase u. Okay, the unemployment rate is equal to the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force, which is also equal to the number of unemployed people divided by the number of employed people plus the number of unemployed people. Okay, and we can divide these into any sort of categories we want. So we can look at teen unemployment by looking at the number of teens that are unemployed divided by the number of teens that are in the labor force, and we can do that for any demographic that we want. Okay, as long as we have the data, right? And so BLS.gov hosts, or publishes, I should say, lots of data on this, basically every month or every quarter, depending on what we're looking for. So depending on the month or the quarter, you can get fresh data from BLS that's current, and revised data from previous reports as well. So go check that out. I'll throw a link into the latest report into Blackboard for you guys. Okay. Now, it's important to recognize that there are limits to our ability to use the unemployment rate to say things that are meaningful. Okay, so let's start with something that it does clue us in on, right? It does reflect the proportion of the group that at that exact time are actively looking for work but are not currently employed, right? It doesn't tell us, though, anything about how hard people are looking for work, right? As the word, actively is never explicitly defined. So I use my little brother as an example, and John, if you hear this, I apologize. He was unemployed for a little while out in California, and while I'm sure he was looking very hard for work, some of the things that he was posting kind of made it on Facebook. I mean, kind of made it look like he really wasn't looking all that hard, right? I'm sure he was, but at least to people on the other side of the country, such as myself, it didn't look like he was looking all that hard, because he was, skateboarding a lot, right? And so when you're skateboarding, you're not looking for a job, right? And so that's the thought there. So the unemployment rate doesn't tell us anything about how hard people are looking for work. It just tells us that they did. Okay. It's also important to recognize that doesn't tell us anything about the actual hardship that these unemployed people are suffering, right? So, it could be the case that being unemployed isn't really all that bad. With generous unemployment insurance, welfare programs and such, it could be the case that being unemployed really doesn't like sting, that badly, right? It also doesn't tell us anything about the number of discouraged workers, right? So as I said to you guys in week 3, I believe it was, in 2010, lots of unemployed people became discouraged workers, which reduced the unemployment rate. But it didn't reduce the unemployment rate for like what I would call like a good reason, right? A good reduction in the unemployment rate would be people finding jobs. A bad reduction would be people giving up finding jobs. Or in the case of one of my favorite economists, Gordon Tullock. So Gordon Tullock used to say, hey, we could reduce the unemployment rate right now. Let's just go down to the unemployment office and shoot all the unemployed people, right? And like he's correct, that would reduce the unemployment rate, but there are other problems with that use or that means of reducing it, right? Namely, that's called murder, and murder is bad, right? So but it would actually reduce the number of the unemployment rate. Like there's no denying that it would. Okay. Second, the unemployment statistics, or the unemployment rate, or anything like that, doesn't tell us anything about the earnings of the people who are employed, right? It just tells us that they had a job or they didn't have a job but are looking, right? So if you work for 10 seconds and you make a nickel, like congratulations, you are employed. You're no longer unemployed. But good luck feeding a family of 4 on a nickel, right? It's not exactly going to be possible, right? And third, a lot of unemployed people today are people who come from households where there are other earners. So, for example, imagine like a teenager, 18-year-old, just graduated from high school but didn't go off to college, right? And this person can't find a job, and in the meantime, they're living with, their rich family, right? Well, it's certainly lamentable that this person can't find a job. But it's not exactly the end of the world, at least for them, right? And I would suggest that there's a slight difference between, the 17 or 18-year-old kid living in his parents' basement that can't find a job, and like the 35-year-old single mother of 6 who can't find a job, right? There's a slight difference between those two things, but the unemployment rate would count them both equally, right? And so that's sort of a problem, right? And fourth, a significant portion of people who count as being unemployed also receive some form of income support or unemployment benefits, either from government or some other form of charity, right? So this isn't to say that these programs are bad. It just says that these programs might entail some unintended consequences. And so I wrote an article for the Freeman, which is up on Blackboard, for you guys to check out. And finally, the unemployment rate tells us nothing about the fraction of the population that is working or looking for work. So if we think about like sort of a admittedly absurd example, right? Imagine that I am the only person in the world, or at least in the country, who's working, and nobody else was even bothering to look for work, right? And I'm working still as an economics professor, okay? So our unemployment rate would be 0%, which on the surface sounds great. But we'd also have nothing to eat, which, that doesn't really sound that good, right? And then compare that to a world where everyone in the U.S. Is currently looking for work, all 319 million of us, and the unemployment rate is 75%. Well, one of these states of the world might be more preferred than the other, but, economics alone really can't tell us the answer to what that is. It just says a few other things, like there will be more people working in that second world. And so, despite all these problems, the unemployment rate is not an entirely useless statistic. However, if we're going to understand what's actually going on in an economy, what we need to understand is what this unemployment rate actually says, and not what we want it to say or what we think it says. Okay? And so what this week's lecture is going to do is develop an understanding of the causes of unemployment and how various government policies affect this either intentionally or unintentionally. Okay, and so one thing that we want to look at is sort of a model of understanding the flows of people between different states of employment and unemployment. Okay, so we call this like the stock flow model. Okay, and what we're saying is that there is like a stock of people, and they're flowing between different states of being. Okay, so people can be employed, right? They can be unemployed, or they can be not in the labor force. Right? And so I'm going to go through these in a different order than the notes, but I'm just going to do it in sort of a logical way. So someone who is employed and becomes and leaves the labor force, right? Those are people that retire, right? So retired people are people that were employed and now they stop working and they're not looking for work either. Okay, so these are retirees, okay? And we would abbreviate people moving in this direction as EN, because they're moving from employed to not in the labor force. And similarly, people moving from employed to unemployed, that's just going to be people losing their jobs, right? So people lost their jobs and now they're unemployed, okay? And we abbreviate that as EU, okay? And people who are unemployed and find a job, right? That's people just finding a job. They move from employed to employed. We would abbreviate that as UE, right? People who move from unemployed to not in the labor force, right? This is when someone who is currently looking for work gives up, right? So they're not working, they can't find work, and eventually they just say, you know, screw it, I'm done. I'm not going to even bother looking for work, no more, right? We would abbreviate this as UN. And we can imagine, so those are like the four simple ones. These are the ones that are really common. We have no qualms with this one. So we need people moving in this direction, right? So what about people who were not in the labor force and now are suddenly counted as unemployed? Well, these are people who kind of, let's see, they decide that they want to go back to work and they can't find a job right away, right? So it can be someone coming out of retirement, right? So they were not in the labor force and they've decided that they're bored at home and they want to go get a job, and so they start looking for work. They would technically be unemployed. Or we can think of this as like you guys, right? After you graduate, let's say you graduate from Ferris and you don't have a job lined up right away, and so you would be not in the labor force because you're in college right now and moving into the unemployed, right? And so we abbreviate this as NU, right, for not to the unemployed, okay? And then we also have some cases of people moving like this, right? So moving from not in the labor force to employed, right, which we abbreviate as NE, right? Those people would be like you guys who have jobs lined up before you graduate, right? So right now you're not in the labor force. If you have a job lined up that that you're going to start working at as soon as you have that shiny piece of paper in hand, you would move from not in the labor force to employed, right? Or we can think of people who were retired who received a job offer that was too good to turn down, and so they entered the labor force again. So a good friend of mine, her dad retired and was, you know, resting and relaxing and enjoying the fruits of his labor, as he likes to put it. And then someone called and offered him the position of chief of staff for, you know, some congressman's personal office, and he took it, right? So he went from not being in the labor force to being employed. Okay, so this is just, you know, people coming out of retirement for the most part, or you guys graduating with a job waiting for you when you graduate. Okay, and so understanding this model, understanding that people are flowing between these three states, and understanding the direction in which they're flowing is actually really important for understanding what's going on here. Okay, so for understanding the economy or the health of the labor market in general, right? That's like a tremendously valuable source and it's a tremendously valuable analytic framework. Okay, so thinking about if we want to see more people being employed, right? We might want to know if it's the case that people are moving from being employed to retiring. Because if that's happening, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? They've earned the right to retire, and so we might want to say like, oh, well, people are leaving the employment sector and going into the not in the labor force, state. And we might say like, oh, okay, well, people are retiring. We want to have them work longer, so we might decide as a political measure, we might say like, oh, well, let's encourage people to retain employees that are older, right? We don't need to encourage or make it easier for people to find work. We need to make it more beneficial to stay working into your twilight years, right? So a policy, if the source of decreasing employment is because people are exiting the labor force because they're retiring, a solution to that is not to make it easier to find jobs, right? These people they're not exiting the labor force because they can't find work. They're exiting the labor force because they don't want to work anymore, right? And so we need to somehow make it more appealing to work. But if people are leaving this employed state and moving into the unemployed state, well, maybe that is because it's difficult for people to find jobs, right? And so if that's the case, then yeah, we might want to adopt a policy measure that makes it easier for people to find work. Okay, so understanding what direction people are flowing in on this model helps us determine what's going on, or what policies we should implement, or at least what the goal of the policy should be, right? Or more specifically, I guess I should say, right? Because obviously, if our goal is to increase the number of employed people, we would care if they're leaving to go this way or if they're leaving to go this way, right? And if we see decreasing numbers of unemployed people, right, that sounds like a great thing until you realize that it could be the case that the reason why there's fewer unemployed people is because they've all given up looking for work, and so they're no longer in the labor force. That would be a bad thing, right? That would be something that we would not want to necessarily celebrate, right? That would be something that we'd say like, oh, we need to fix that, right? But if it's the case that unemployed people are moving into new jobs, right, then we should celebrate. We've done something great. Okay, so understanding where people are on this graph, or this chart, or this diagram, right, and then in which direction they're going, helps us understand what sort of policies would actually be effective at accomplishing the goals that we want to accomplish. Okay, so in the next video, we'll talk about different types of unemployment.